Hello friends and welcome. I am so excited to share with you today how I turned our house into a little gingerbread cottage. I had so much fun with this project. So this is my second year making gingerbread houses from scratch. Last year was my first time ever making one from scratch. My very first try was quite a failure, but I tried again and I had so much fun. And so I just knew I wanted to make this a tradition every single year to make a gingerbread house from scratch. And I want to sort of like every year up the ante and just sort of try some new things and test out new stuff. So honestly, this was a little bit of a reach. I made my own template and I did quite a few new things that I didn't do last year that I had never done before. And so this was quite a learning experience and it was just a lot of fun. So I'm really excited to share with you how I did that. So it took me several hours over several days in order to do this, but for you it'll be just a couple minutes and I'll take you through the whole process. Over the years, I've learned that any good project usually starts with a really good plan. I wanted my gingerbread house this year to be inspired by our own cottage, so I started by pulling up a photo of our house and just kind of loosely sketching. I am certainly no amazing artist, especially when it comes to drawing, but I just wanted to sort of get the idea down for the facade so that I could create a better plan. I then sketched out a overhead view, trying to figure out some of those roof lines since I knew that that would be pretty important to figure out for creating the gingerbread house. The next step was I used foam board, also known as project board, that you can just pick up at Michael's or any craft store, and I used that to create an actual physical template and try to figure out every single piece that I would need to cut out of gingerbread in order to actually make the house. If you ever want to make your own custom gingerbread house, you absolutely do not want to skip this step. This is just so important to actually making sure all of your pieces are going to fit together and you don't forget any pieces, and just all of that stuff you can kind of work out in this stage. And that way, when you go to actually bake some gingerbread, you're not wasting all of that time. You will know that you have every single piece accounted for and planned. Once I was happy with my template, I made sure to label every single piece. That way I didn't get confused, and then I could disassemble all of it and use all of those pieces to cut out my gingerbread. Okay, so I feel like my mock-up actually came out pretty darn cute. I decided to wait on figuring out the windows until it was all put together and plan out the windows to where you can kind of see the size and shape. So I'm gonna kind of draw those out, sketch those out, and then we can take this all apart. I can cut out the windows and then we can start baking. I will link my gingerbread recipe below. I definitely recommend using a scale to weigh out your flour, especially when it comes to gingerbread house making. Having pretty exact ingredients really helps in making sure that you have the right consistency for a gingerbread that will hold together and hold its shape really well. Like most cutout cookies, it is especially important to make sure you let gingerbread chill. So I let mine chill overnight before I started cutting out my shapes. Since some of my pieces were going to be on the bigger side, I ended up figuring out that it was best to use the back side of my baking sheet. So I flipped over my baking sheet, I would lay my parchment over it, and then I would drape the gingerbread over top, and then I would use my template pieces to cut out the actual shapes for the gingerbread house. My gingerbread recipe really does hold its shape well. However, like almost all dough, it will somewhat grow in the oven a little bit, and I really liked having really crisp edges. So one thing that I did, which you have to be very careful of, is that as soon as the dough came out of the oven, when it was done baking, I would actually lay my template back over top, and I would go back and kind of like cut out the edges that grew just a little bit using my dough cutter, and then I would also trim some of the windows back again with my X-Acto knife just to get those super crisp edges. For the windows, I just combined a half a cup of Isomalt with 2 tablespoons of water and microwaved until all of the crystals fully dissolved, regularly checking and stirring. And then I let it cool for just a little bit so it wasn't bubbling before I poured it into my windows. I made several batches of royal icing over the course of this project, and I feel like each time I learned a little bit more. Even though I have made and worked with royal icing in the past, I've never quite found my groove with it. It feels impossible to get it to the right consistency that you need, which is always really frustrating, but after making several batches over the course of a couple days, I now feel just a little bit more comfortable working with it. I did follow a lot of the actual trim lines that our own house has. However, I definitely took some creative liberty and I decided to kind of go the extra mile and add some extra fun trim lines throughout the house. In retrospect, I should have definitely done the design on the windows before the trim around the windows. I also learned later that while this batch of royal icing was pretty good for the trim, it would have been better to use a much stiffer icing for that delicate type of design I was trying to do on the windows. I originally was just planning on doing white icing, but I ended up deciding my gingerbread house really needed a few little pops of color, and recreating our own bright red door would be a really fun touch. So I did start by filling the door space in just with white, just as like an icing base, and then I got to work actually mixing some colors. One trick that I have learned when it comes to royal icing and trying to get bright colors or just really deep colors is that often if you let them sit overnight, they really brighten up. So that's what I did with this red. So you can see it looked a little bit more pink when I was mixing it, but then it ended up looking like a nice, deep, bright red the next day when I went to work with it. While I was at it, I also mixed up some green royal icing, and honestly, I wasn't totally sure at first what I was going to use it for, but I started just sort of playing around with it, and I got the idea to create some mini wreaths to put around the house. I was even able to make little red bows for my wreaths, which I'm kind of obsessed with. I made the wreaths on some parchment paper, and then I let those fully dry out overnight before transferring them onto the house. I also thought it would be fun to add some green to the windows so that it looked like they had little window boxes, and I think it added just the perfect amount of color to the house while still letting it feel fairly simple and not overdone, but just a little bit of fun and magic. I had just the littlest bit of dough left over when I was baking my gingerbread, and I decided at the very last minute to try to add a chimney to my gingerbread house, which are these pieces which I'm adding the brick design to. I ended up kind of just wandering around my house trying to figure out what surface would be big enough to put my house on, and ended up grabbing this scrap piece of curdy board, which was from our bathroom remodel. Basically, it's similar to drywall but made for bathrooms, so it's like water resistant. I grabbed it out of desperation, but honestly, it worked out really well since it's nice and sturdy, not too heavy, and it holds its shape and doesn't flex. I had almost forgotten that I had planned to add fairy lights inside. I should have fished the wire underneath the outside of the house, but I ended up just fishing it in through the back under the roof, which also worked out just fine. But just one of those silly little things that sometimes when you're working on stuff, you just totally forget until the last second. The roof was definitely the most challenging part when it came to putting it all together. Since it has a pretty steep roof line, I pretty much had to hold this first piece in place for a good 10 or 15 minutes until it was somewhat dry so that it didn't just slide off. I did also finally find an object that I was able to get to stay at this weird angle to help hold it up, and I let that fully dry before I added any of the other roof pieces. The dormer window was also quite finicky to get on since it had to sit at an odd angle. In retrospect, I should have attached the dormer window before I actually attached the roof to the rest of the structure, but it did all end up working out in the end. Finally, to cover up my not so pretty board and add just a last little bit of magic, I used some really loose royal icing to flood the board so that it would look like a thick layer of snow had just fallen. After a good dusting of powdered sugar, my house was all done. And I have to say, this is one of my favorite projects I have worked on all year, and I am already looking forward to making a gingerbread house again next year. I hope your holidays are wonderful, and I wish you all the best for the new year.